So just to pick up on Brishkai's remarks, the Afghan conflict is often looked at in terms of great power politics, and that certainly makes a great deal of sense if we look at Afghan history over the last two and a half centuries. In the 19th century, Afghanistan was a major state in the what was called the Great Game by Kipling, the rivalry between Tsarist Russia and the British Empire in South Asia. And that rivalry continued down until the Bolshevik Revolution through most of the 20th century. Afghanistan was a stake in the rivalry between the Soviet Union and British with American backing, especially after the Second World War. In the period after 1945, Afghanistan was a stake in the Cold War rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union following the British withdrawal from India in 1947. And in the 50s and the 1960s, Afghan governments succeeded in taking a non-aligned stance that managed to play off the two superpowers to various extents. Afghanistan remained a largely subsistence economy with the large gap between the rural society and the elite in the capital, in Kabul. But the elite in the capital, which was made up down until 1978 predominantly by Durrani Pashtuns, managed to play off the two superpowers and a number of other powers to gain aid in important ways for the Afghan state, with in particular the Soviet Union supplying military training and equipment through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, the US supplying support for various engineering projects during that time, the French supplying medical support, including support for the medical faculty in the University of Kabul, which down until the late 1970s was the only university in the country. One of the big issues in Afghanistan politics from the late 19th century down, I would say, until the present time, is the relationship with territories that are now in Pakistan. In particular, the territories in the Northwest Frontier Province. And so this is a particular dynamic between British India in the early 20th century, mid-20th century, and the Afghan state. It still becomes an even hotter issue between the Afghan state and the state of Pakistan after Pakistani independence in 1947. The Afghan state saw strong connections politically and socially and ethnically with the Pashtun population in the Northwest Frontier Province of Pakistan. And the predominant population ethnically within Afghanistan are the Pashtun population, down until mid-20th century, more frequently known by the term Afghan. It's only from the 1970s that the term Afghan began to be used widely for all the ethnic groups within Afghanistan. The question of the relationship between Pashtun population in Afghanistan and the Afghan state and the Pashtun population in the Northwest Frontier Province of what's now Pakistan was a heated one in the 1940s. There were calls from Afghans in Afghanistan for independence for the Pashtuns in the Northwest Frontier Province. That would not be included then in the state of Pakistan, or for inclusion of Northwest Frontier Province into the Afghan state, going back to the territory, some of the territory that the Afghan state had in the early 19th century. That dialectic between Afghanistan and Pakistan, that tension between the two of them, remains in place down until the present time, and it's often cited as one of the reasons why Pakistan supported the Taliban in the 1990s as a way of diffusing the tensions between the two states. So to go very briefly, how am I doing on time?
Oh, you've got 6 minutes.
Okay, great. So different phases of Afghan politics since the 1950s. A period of absolute rule was in place down until 1960, 1963, 1964. During the 50s and the early 60s, there were strong tensions between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Afghan state has never recognized the border between the two countries, which was drawn up by the British in the 1890s and imposed on Afghanistan at that time. In the 1960s, Afghanistan had a liberalization of the political system, although there were still no political parties allowed. Political parties under the Constitution of 1964 were foreseen to be operating in principle, but the particular legislation that would have enabled them to actually form up never actually was passed before the monarchy was overthrown in 1973. It was overthrown by a cousin of the king, who had been the regent back in the 1950s. And through the 50s and the 60s, 70s, there was rivalry between the king and that particular cousin. The cousin's name was Mohammed Daoud. And Daoud became the president in 1973 in a new republic. He became president and established that new republic with the backing of left-wing officers within the Afghan military, who had been formed up by Soviet military aid over the previous decade. In the mid-1970s, Daoud began to have doubts about their loyalty. He began to move closer to the Shah of Iran after Iran began to have large oil revenues after the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. And he began moving closer to Egypt as well. And that led the leftists within the Afghan state at that time, to fear that Daoud, the president, was going to crack down on them, as the Shah of Iran had been cracking down on any dissidents within Iran. Daoud was overthrown in 1978 in a coup by communists. Communists in Afghanistan were organized into two sharply hostile factions hostile to one another. That rivalry continued over the following decade. Because of that rivalry, and because of the upheaval into which the country was thrown by the radical reforms attempted by the one faction made up especially of Ghilzai Pashtuns, the Soviets intervened at the end of 1979. Soviet occupation lasted from 79 until the beginning of 1989, with support for the Islamicist resistance to Soviet occupation and to communist reform being funded by Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and the United States. Aid funneled through Pakistani intelligence services, with Pakistan's military dictatorship at the time keen to engage the United States in the region so that it would continue to be a Pakistani ally against India in the long-running India-Pakistan conflict.
2 minutes.
Okay, thanks. Soviet occupation came to an end in the late 1980s when Mikhail Gorbachev finally decided it wasn't worth staying any longer, and he pulled out. One of the enduring Afghan attitudes towards foreign occupation has been to make the country ungovernable, not worth staying within. That's what happened when the British occupied the country twice in the 19th century. It's what happened in the 1980s when the Soviets occupied the country, and one can argue that it's what has happened again in the last decade with the U.S. occupation. U.S. occupation, which Jason will say more about, I think, took place in October and November of 2001 after the September 11th attacks on the United States. Osama bin Laden had been one of the foreign fighters working with the Mujahideen during the 1980s. He left the country after the Soviet occupation ended. returned in 1996 after the Taliban had taken Kabul. Taliban managed to take Kabul with Pakistani support, in particular with the support of the administration of Benazir Bhutto, who was unhappy with the people that had been supported previously by the Pakistani intelligence agencies to fight against the Soviets. And the current insurgency in Afghanistan involves people that were fighting against the Soviets and armed by the Americans in the 1980s. But most of the backers, the regional warlords, provincial governors who are backing Hamid Karzai also come from that same resistance movement against the Soviets in the 1980s. So what we see is the Mujahideen in the 1990s splitting into various factions fighting against one another. To some extent, that's still continuing down to the present time. And I'll leave it there. Other speakers will presumably pick up on the more recent history. Thanks.